I'd like to thank everyone for coming to today's webinar on the topic of asset management for municipalities in Nova Scotia. This afternoon, we're going to have two speakers, the first of which is just a moment. Sorry about this, just a technical problem. We're having two speakers today on this topic. The first will be Matt Delorme from the Atlantic Infrastructure Management Network, and the second will be Gary Lines. I'm your host today. My name is Kyle McKenzie. I'm with the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities and very happy to see that so many of you have decided to join us today. We'll have the two speakers back to back. I will be recording the webinar and I will give you the address at the end of the presentation to show you where it will be posted after the fact. After our two speakers present, I'll give you some information about the NSFM's offerings in asset management, information, and training. And then that will be followed by a question and answer session for our two speakers. We'll have them take questions at the same time in case they have differing opinions on some of the questions or wish to be complimentary to each other. So with that, we'll go to Matt, and I'm just going to execute another technical challenge here. And hopefully we can get Matt in charge.
It still has me disabled on sharing.
Okay, Matt.
No, it's still saying that host disabled participant screen sharing.
Where do I get that? How about I make you a co-host? How's that?
That might just do it.
Okay.
No, it's still saying disable. Let me see if we can go into participant. So it's not, I'm not coming up as co-host.
Yeah. Did that help? You're now host.
No, and in the participant list, it still has you as host.
Oh, sorry, I've got this. There you go.
Okay. That seems to have done it. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll switch it over to you, Gary, once I'm finished here, because that seems to have worked. So I will share my screen and I'll start from the beginning. So hopefully you are all now looking at a presentation display here. Someone just maybe shout out Kyle. Is it showing?
It's showing on my end.
Okay, great. Yeah, so first of all, thanks a lot to to Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities for inviting us to put on this awareness building activity. We're going to talk a bit about the road ahead in Nova Scotia, because when I looked at the participant list, I noticed a lot of familiar names on there. So originally I was going to go a bit through on what AIM Network does and how we've helped out and what our training programs are in the past, but I saw a lot of people have actually availed themselves of it. So I adjusted a little bit, and we're going to look a little bit forward here. So first of all, I just wanted to say that this awareness building activity for us is funded through the Municipal Asset Management Program, delivered by FCM and funded by the Government of Canada. And with that, you'll see in the chat that I've actually posted a survey link. And part of these awareness building activities, as FCM likes to see, did you get to learn something new? So if you don't mind, when the presentation's finished here, if you can click on that, it just takes a minute or two to complete. Select AIM Network as the partner. I'll also put a QR code up at the end. But it really does help us get feedback on what's useful and how to adjust these in the future, and really helps FCM to see how their funding programs are being used. So please take a minute or two to do that at the end of the presentation. So for those of you who have not worked with AIM Network, we're a not-for-profit community of practice. We do training, education, and technical assistance with the general mandate to advance the practice of asset management in Atlantic Canada. We have board members, one from each province, usually a town manager or CAO, and in fact, our illustrious Nova Scotia board member, Dylan Hyde, is on the line here, so good to see you, Dylan. I'm Matt Delorme. I'm the AIM Network's executive director. Prior to that, I was AIM Network's technical program manager, building training programs. And before that, I spent a couple of decades as a civil engineer, working in engineering consulting, doing all kinds of municipal design, but with a focus on stormwater management and control and hydrology and climate change. So just quickly going over the road behind us here, and I know a lot of the communities here have actually done some of this work, is we had a big focus over the last 5 or 6 years on developing policies and governance structures for asset management, starting to build asset inventories, doing those initial risk assessments to define priorities, starting to define levels of service, and building short-term project projections in order to start getting a handle on what was most important to deal with in terms of aging infrastructure and climate risks and that sort of thing. So we've done a lot of really good work in Atlantic Canada, and I would say in Nova Scotia in particular. Like AIM Networks had the pleasure of working with over half of the municipalities in Nova Scotia. And I know there's a number out there who have been advancing their asset management programs without working with AIM. So Nova Scotia is actually pushing forward quite well in terms of asset management. However, I've just got a quote here from the 2019 Canada Infrastructure Report Card. I like a good sort of sense of humor with our apocalypse news. And in that report card, they said that there's enough Canadian roads in poor condition to build a road almost halfway to the moon. And I thought that was an interesting statistic. What's actually been happening is that our roads and some facilities and sewers are actually we're falling behind. There's some other things like water systems and some recreational facilities that we have been making gains in the past number of years with our asset management programs, but some of them are still falling behind. So the point being is that yes, we've made a lot of progress in terms of logging what we have and knowing where we need to go. But in terms of the actual outcomes from when Infrastructure Canada first did the study 2014, 2015, and saw that half of our infrastructure was going to reach end of life by 2027, we're keeping up with that demand, but we're not catching up on it. So there's still work to do. The current state of play in the asset management world is that by various estimates, you'll see a chart on the slide, there's 110 to $270 billion worth of infrastructure deficit in Canada. That number right there tells us something important. If you look, that's an over 100% difference in the estimates of what that deficit is. So even though we've done lots of work in terms of collecting inventory and getting condition assessments and projections, we haven't done a good job of consolidating it. So there's still a pretty big question of how much work actually needs to be done. The majority of infrastructure, typically thought to be about 60 to 65%, is controlled by local governments. So you folks here are handling a lot of this infrastructure that we need to deal with in the next couple of decades. It's also important to note that these estimates we're seeing here don't consider changes in service levels, infrastructure failure, damage from extreme weather events that come along with climate change, which we all know is currently we're experiencing and is going to get more pronounced in the future. To that end, you can see a chart on the side here that the insured catastrophic losses in Canada are definitely increasing. This is from the Insurance Bureau of Canada here. What's particularly unsettling about this is that those are built off of any events that cost $25 million or more. Those are inflation adjusted numbers. So that's considering back in the 80s, those values are actually boosted to be 2020, I believe 2021 dollars. So we're definitely seeing an impact indisputably in terms of the damage that's being paid out. And just as a Atlantic Canada example, Dorian was $102 million. Fiona was $660 million. That's just in the last couple of years. Prior to that, the most expensive weather event in terms of damage in Atlantic Canada was Juan at $85 million. So when you look at the numbers, there's definitely something happening here. So we need to not only deal with our aging infrastructure and how we're going to keep those services going, but we have to consider what's going to happen with climate as well. What we're going to see along with that is that insurance rates are going to increase, or we're actually even now seeing areas becoming uninsurable. There's places on Briar Island, for example, that can't get insurance because of the proximity to the shoreline. So that's the bad news on the state of play. I'll now leave you with a bit of a better taste in your mouth with it. Aaron, good to see you here from FCM. They received $530 million last fall to the Green Municipal Fund, and that's going to come out in three streams. The first one is going to support asset management with an adaptation focus. The second stream is going to be adaptation planning and pilot projects, and then there's another stream for capital projects. So a lot of the efforts from FCM, in contrast to the previous years, are going to come under one program so that they can really coordinate these outcomes. And there's definitely going to be an adaptation focus to it, which is very timely because in the previous slide, you saw that that's very well needed. There's going to be a shift from federal priorities from mitigation to adaptation. I know a lot of people have done work on energy sufficiency and energy efficiency. The new focus is going to be on adaptation, which is going to be looking at making sure that we can continue to provide services as we meet the threats of climate change. And again, with my personal background in design and working with climate change, I'm really happy to see that because we see the impacts of it all the time. And adaptation is definitely something that pays for itself. The typical numbers you see are that spending $1 on adaptation can save you between $6 and $15 in damage repair. Another thing that's particularly interesting in a Nova Scotia context is that the province has this strategy to double our population by 2060. That's an additional 25,000 residents annually. So this is something really unique for Nova Scotia. Like in the past, all of you have been working in municipal government for a while. This hasn't been something that we've been dealing with. And when I get out talking to municipalities, I'm hearing very often the words unprecedented growth, or we've never seen anything like this. And it's particularly important out in our rural or hybrid rural urban areas, in terms of how to adapt to that growth and provide the right infrastructure to support it and make that balance between new revenues coming in from people moving there and current and future expenditures in order to support that growth. So we have this very strong groundwork for Atlantic Canada in asset management planning. Again, a lot of the municipalities that I see on the list here have inventories together, have started doing short-term capital planning, and have good governance structures in place. But the challenges are going to be new over the next 10, 15 years. The municipal landscape is really changing. Fundamentally, it's because of the changing priorities, because of climate change, and because of this new growth that we're expecting to see in Nova Scotia. So what does that look like for the road ahead? So first of all, now is probably a good time. I think around 2011, 2012, everyone had to put together the Integrated Community Sustainability Plans, the ICSPs. Probably now is a good time to perhaps take a look at revisiting those and really start to think about what is your community going to look like in 30 or 50 years. Out where I live in the Annapolis Valley, I know there's lots of discussion around that because there's a lot of places that have seen static or very minimal growth, and they're starting to see that there's a lot higher growth. So places that never had high density developments before are thinking about how they're going to build those and support it with their infrastructure. Also, in the more rural communities, they're looking at targeted development so they can protect natural areas. In the groups that I hang around looking at climate impacts, there's a real sense that as we get in decades into the future, there's going to be a real risk to more southern food production areas, whereas we might actually get improved capacity here in Nova Scotia. So it's important that we think about things like protecting our agricultural areas as we get development coming in, so that we're able to take advantage of that and make sure that we're thinking about food security. So it's a bunch of new modern complications that we need to think about in our strategic plans. In terms of capital financing strategies, most people have done preliminary risk assessments and those short-term projections. We need to start thinking a lot more about where the right risks are to take and how to set levels of service in a way that are affordable and acceptable to residents in terms of their willingness to pay. Also, how is additional revenue and growth going to factor into that? Because new people coming in are great, but there's also a demand for new and changing infrastructure with that. So how is that interplay going to come forward, and how are we going to avoid the issues that we had in the past, where we built a bunch of new infrastructure in the 60s and 70s and didn't think about how we were going to replace it now when it was coming to end of life? So really what we need to do is look at realistic plans for limited resources. And I can say what that's probably going to look like for you in the next few years is this Venn diagram here of aging assets and climate risk, where you can see that there's that combination. Those are going to be really good projects for you to take as a strategy to begin or to carry on with your infrastructure renewal. Climate risk and adaptation, as you gathered from the earlier slides, is going to be really important. That's going to mean doing vulnerability assessments. I sit on a working group with the PIVC, Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee, to talk to them about how that's going to become more applicable for smaller and medium-sized municipalities. And they've come up with something that's just about to be released called the IVC protocol for large portfolios, people like municipalities who have a wide range of assets and really need to narrow that down to where their risks are. And then also thinking about funding strategies, how adaptation is going to factor into your ability to put applications in for funding. We also see an area that people are going to start growing in terms of data management, both tracking the performance of their infrastructure over time, now that you have initial inventories, and being able to really refine those level of service assessments, and also how operation and maintenance is going to factor into stretching your infrastructure life and performance over time, because there are going to be limited resources in order to renew or rehabilitate infrastructure. The final thing that we see really coming up is natural assets. So looking at how natural assets are contributing to your services. There's some Engineers BC guides. If you wanted to check them out, go to EGBC and look up natural assets. And they have guidelines for municipalities and looking at natural assets. In June, there's a new CSA standard coming out. But one area that we see is going to need some work is how those guidelines are practically applied to your asset management programming. And we're actually doing a pilot project with one of our climate cohorts in New Brunswick to do exactly that. Take those existing standards and bring it down into a real practical application that fits in with the rest of your asset management planning and prioritization. So just lastly here, how can AIM Network help? We currently have online training cohorts. We're just about to start one on level of service assessments. We're going to be getting into not just customer levels of service, but how do your technical performance measures and your operational requirements fit into those level of service assessments. So digging a little bit deeper into it than we've gotten in the past. Following that, we're going to be looking at risk assessments, combining age, development demands, and climate risks. The fourth one is going to be data management. And the final one's going to be on capital planning, is how do you juggle all of these priorities? Those are online courses combined with online not in person, but online with a person help desk support. So if you're interested in any of those, I've got some contact information on the side. Our level of service one is starting in the beginning of April, with the other ones following after that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. It's a series of videos that you can watch on your own time. To give you an idea of cost, it's about $250 per course, and that covers, again, with the generous help of our friends at FCM, as many people as you would like from your municipality to join in with the program. So if you have any questions, email me directly or info at AIM Network. And on our website, you'll be able to find all the course descriptions and how to register. I mentioned how we're looking at natural assets. We're also putting on some regional climate events across Atlantic Canada. We've got 5 regions putting on public engagement events and doing joint projects as a region. We're really starting to work with people as well on strategic alignment, like how those strategies are going to tie into your asset management policy. And I also mentioned the application of PIVC to small communities. So I'm just going to remind you again, I have pasted into the chat the link to the FCM survey. You'll just select the partner organization AIM and answer the questions there. It only takes a minute or two. If you have your smartphone handy, this QR code will also take you there. And with that, I will wrap up my portion of the session here. And I'm going to pull up the participant list and pass hosting over to Carrie. Make host. Okay, Gary, so you should be host now and you should be able to share.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Okay. So the see if I can manipulate the screen enough to get this set up. Just hold on a second. Okay. Yeah, I was trying to position something here. Sorry for the delay here. Yeah, I'm just attempting to move the bar out so I can manipulate my slideshow here. I'm just having a little difficulty with it. Sorry, guys. It's this way. All right, let's do this way. So can everyone see what's going on there? Okay. Yes, thank you to Kyle and NSFM, as well as other partners like FCM, for inviting us, ClimAction Services, to present on integrating climate change into asset management. The background for this, very briefly, is that back in January of 2019, we had the opportunity to partner with FCM and NSFM on a workshop we did with representatives from a variety of municipalities across Nova Scotia. And at that time, one of our partners, WSP Engineering, brought in some asset management expertise. We had sort of a half day on that. And then and the second part was on incorporating climate change. The result of that was an approach that we, along with our partners, have developed, and that the group at the workshop really endorsed. And it actually morphed into something that we now call the climate resilience approach. And all I'm going to do today is, after some introduction to who we are and what we've done, is do pretty much a high-level introduction to what that is, how it works with asset management, and then kind of move forward into questions after that for both Matt and myself. As to who we are a four-partner consulting firm with expertise based in climate and meteorology. And over the past, I'd say about 12, 13 years, we've worked with over a dozen communities in Nova Scotia with a variety of capacities, worked with HRM, worked with CBRM, as well as smaller communities on a variety of climate issues, all the way from Climate Change 101 up to and including incorporating PIVC, working with other varieties of risk and vulnerability assessments, working towards adaptive management strategies for some communities, and basically spending a lot of time on issues of community engagement and capacity and knowledge building. Back in 2011, when we started all of this, we really weren't sure what scale of work we would end up doing, because at that time, there wasn't really anything pushing forward in an organized way to actually allow communities to access this information. Luckily, by now, there's been a lot of advancement on that, and we've actually worked with a number of communities that that I think are well placed now to move forward on a lot of these issues. Why do we do it? Well, it should be pretty obvious. This is just one slide from our extreme events talk that we usually give. This is the more recent November 2021 rainfall event and the resulting infrastructure damage from it. This is predominantly the kind of conversation that we're having right now with any of the clients that we have, whether they be large communities or small. And really it's the one that's brought everything to the forefront, not only impact on infrastructure, but its subsequent impact on public safety and health for these communities. I do understand that this is quite a large diagram, lots of small writing. So for the sake of reading ability and brevity for this talk, I have shortened this, but this in a nutshell is the stepwise process we use when we go in and talk about community resilience and how to incorporate climate change, not just in asset management, but to mainstream it across all the decision-making processes in communities. So I'm going to stay high level and walk through this and then get to sort of the nut of it at the end. There is a lot of certainly detail underneath this, but we'll leave that for discussion. So the resilience framework was based on the work that came out of that workshop in 2019. It's a way that it can combine both integrating climate change into asset management planning, but also into other community concerns. Damage to culturally significant areas, historically important areas, environmentally sensitive areas, and so on. So the framework can cover a broader sense of what goes on. But the core of it, as you can see from the top part of the framework here, which I've blown up for easy reading, is basically setting up the community to move forward with accepting climate change as a way to move into community resilience planning. Now, the good news is that most, if not all, the communities that we work with and may even be on the phone call today have kind of already done all this front work. That they've taken a look at climate change in their communities. They have quite possibly in their communities what we call a champion or someone coordinating what's going on. They already talk about climate change in their communication strategies on how to get to sustainable development. And they are already developing plans. Most notably, most communities, certainly back in the day, spent a lot of time and effort on municipal climate change action plans, MCAPs, but there are other levels of planning that they've done. But that was the front end that didn't exist 10 or 12 years ago, and now I think we're well along that route. But where the rubber hits the road is the second part of the framework, which is identifying the hazards, undertaking forensic analysis of those hazards, and by identifying the vulnerabilities and the risks associated with them, develop an adaptive management plan to mitigate that hazard. So that's, again, where most of the work would happen. This is what it looks like in the framework, starting with the risk assessments based on projections of hazards, as well as some forensic work on what's happened in the past, developing an adaptive management plan in order to move that forward. And then an element that doesn't get talked about much, but is actually key all the way through the framework, is that there's education and outreach going on, meaning that during the whole process, there's a huge amount of consultation at every level, both at the beginning, through the middle, and even through the planning of the management plan at the end, with community members at all levels. So what we bring forward then is this kind of a framework in order to move forward. But how does it actually integrate with asset management? Clearly, there's a lot of detail to that, and I'll talk about some resources at the end. But I just popped up just a brief example here. The stepwise process that goes through it, once you've identified that you want to start incorporating it, you would kind of go through and isolate these elements. What's the hazard that you want to look at? For this high-level example, I just used urban flooding and the frequent heavy precipitation. The impact, of course, is overflow of stormwater infrastructure. What's the approach? Well, you complete a risk assessment based on the frequency of the hazard and projected over the life cycle of the current infrastructure. So let's have a look at what's being impacted. Is this infrastructure that needs ongoing maintenance or repairs? Is something that can wait? What's the life cycle process for that infrastructure? Identify vulnerable locations in the community and what materials are particularly failing under the impact of the hazard. Then you can start, once you've identified all these vulnerabilities and risks, you can start creating that adaptation plan based on where there's a shortfall in infrastructure performance and what the life cycle of specific infrastructure is. Now, these are key elements because if you've got infrastructure that you're planning to not modify or don't need to modify for decades, then that starts to play into how quickly or how importantly a lot of these risks are. And that's the kind of harder work to get that incorporated into the asset management planning on this. Now, I just want to make a tie-in here between the broader framework and asset management. In the broader framework, the sort of ultimate product you would come out with would be an adaptive management approach to dealing with the risks in your community from climate change impacts. Most of those span decades. What we recommend is that once that adaptive management plan is created, that it actually be a living, breathing mechanism. That, and this is very similar to asset management planning, that you do it on a cycle. Now, for most of these things, if we set asset management aside for a second, most of these things, you can do it on about a 5-6 year cycle, meaning you go back, have a look at how things are doing. For example, let's say you put in plan an adaptive management program to handle extreme heat in your community. And you set up cooling centers and you do various other things, and you just kind of instituted it and you just let it kind of roll ahead. If you don't go back and review how well that's doing, then you're never going to really be able to determine how well that's going to work. In the case of asset management, you're constantly monitoring, you're constantly planning. Your horizons are different for every different type of asset that you have to deal with. So it fits naturally into that adaptive management approach that put forward with climate change. Broadly, the framework has a variety of benefits. Again, this is the broader framework. So it incorporates not just using it to work with asset management, but in terms of designing resilient community assets and dealing with extreme weather threats, but also things like protecting public safety and health, which is tied to asset management, supporting economic growth and development, and allowing for the design of adaptive management strategies to address and reduce significant impacts in the face of changing climate. I just want to finish off by noting that we've seen our role as consultants change over time. At the beginning, it was much more of an information out process with communities. Now it's more of working and working integrally with communities in order to get to the kind of adaptive management approaches that they need. Still do a lot of information out, still have information regarding tools available, but it's the community engagement part that really kind of came to the forefront when we started working with communities. The fact that when we go into a community, you always have the hazard of going in and saying, well, here's your answer, take it, and then you leave. Whereas we quickly discovered that the much more effective way is go in and find out where they're at, what their priorities are, and then work with that. Most notably, most recently, working with African Nova Scotia communities and Indigenous communities on a lot of key issues for them to move forward, and has actually forced us to look at broader ranges of way to deal with some of these issues. I'll leave it there with these two items. We really see that in case of asset management, a continuation on from the work that was started in January 2019 might be worthwhile. It could be in the form of a pilot project, for example, to kind of move forward with how to incorporate these things effectively. The reason there should be sort of a format of a pilot project is that each community has its own range of criteria, assets, and approaches and capacity. So this is not meant to be sort of cookie cutter, one size fits all thing. A pilot project could easily identify where the ranges of those things could work and how we could move forward with this. As well, you can also use components of the framework, like you can do some assessments, or some assessments may already be done, and use those in future criteria for funding. And as Matt just illustrated, there will be funding coming. I'll finish there. Just to note two resources. One is that out of that January 2019 workshop, there was a paper done called A Path Forward. This was sitting on the FCM site. I can have Kyle confirm that, or if someone needs it, we have it, obviously. The other one is one that was recently posted as a guide. This is an extremely interesting document, and it does cover a variety of different asset scales, levels of service that can be incorporated. And from that document, you can easily see that there are a variety of ways to actually go at this problem and move forward with it. Thank you for that, and I'll finish there.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Matt. Two very interesting presentations. Before we finish up with questions, I just want to make a quick informative slide, put it up for you to tell you a bit about NSFM's online asset management courses. The first item that we have available, both of which are at the website listed below, is a free publication called the Data Collection Standard Operating Procedure Guide for Linear Assets. People tend to think of a lot of asset management as point data collection, but obviously municipalities deal with roads and water pipes and sewer pipes. So the practice of collecting linear data really needs to be looked at in the context of asset management. The second is an online course called The Basics of Asset Management for Elected Officials. Now, unlike the very practical things, technical things that Gary and Matt have talked about, this particular course is aimed at either elected officials who really need to understand why asset management is important and how they can communicate this to the public and their fellow elected officials, or for staff people who feel asset management is important and would like to communicate this to the elected officials in the hopes of seeking approval to undertake an asset management plan. We've traditionally charged $175 for this, but as a special limited time offer to try to generate more interest in the content, we've reduced the price to $100. And the discount code is down there, $100. You can get to that course through the NSFM website as listed below. And as I said at the start, this webinar will also be posted there. One more thing that both Matt and Gary have mentioned is FCM's Green Municipal Fund has new streams of funding coming on, including some for asset management and climate change adaptation. Now, coincidentally, this is the topic of NSFM's next webinar, which is still in the planning stages, so I can't give you a date, but we will hope to have representatives from FCM and another organization to talk about some of these funding opportunities and how Nova Scotia municipalities can take advantage of them. So with that, we'll try to get our two speakers back on. And let's see. And we'll take questions. If you want to use the hand feature, I'll try to. We'll try to unmute you so you can ask your question. And the two presenters, if they can unmute themselves, that will make it easier to take questions. Perhaps while everyone is thinking of questions, I can put a question to Gary. The latest synthesis report from the IPCC came out recently for the sixth assessment report. Have you taken a look at that? And particularly because it's a summary for policymakers, any salient content or comments or observations?
Yeah, we're still digesting that, Kyle, but I don't think there's really any surprises there. I think the biggest concern, as I say, and this is the conversation that we've been having with clients, is around extreme weather and trying to come to grips with the changing frequency and intensity. Just to remind folks that I guess, okay, I'm trying to weed this down so that we don't spend 2 hours on this, but one of the challenges with that is our initial concern that not just assets material within communities, it's also their capacity and ability to react and be proactive with these extreme events. I think there's a huge challenge, not just in Nova Scotia, obviously. I think nationally, there's still a huge challenge in dealing with the public safety aspect of a lot of these things. I think that's what really has come to the core recently in any of the discussions we have is, okay, we just got whacked with another rainfall event. What do we do about that? And one of the things that continually concerns me personally, as well as my partners, is that even though we will work with the community, plans will be set up and we'll move forward, it's still a challenge. It's still a huge challenge to place yourself properly when these events are continually getting more frequent and more intense. And I don't think there's actually a resistance to doing anything with this. I think obviously it all comes down to resourcing issues. What are your priorities? Where are you going to go? But one of the key things that we discovered in talking to communities was that when things like emergency planning, emergency event planning, it came around to the discussion, most communities felt, and this was 2 or 3 years ago now, but most communities felt rather prepared for what was going to come. And until we got into discussions, hard discussions around, well, you've set up a cooling center. That's just the extreme heat scenario, but set up a cooling center, let's say in a local school, and you've got lots of ways to deal with that. But now, if the power goes out, can you maintain the cooling center, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of aspects of the detail of the emergency planning that hadn't really been put through a climate lens for a lot of these communities. And so that's kind of where we're sitting with a lot of the discussions that we're having. And anything that from this point on that comes through either IPCC, the United Nations group, or really any of the research that comes out keeps pointing in that direction, that not only do we have to be aware of these things coming, but we have to be nimble enough to realize that we can make the best plans possible today, but unless we're adaptive with time, monitor how things go and change things, then we're still going to be chasing this problem.
Looks like you have a question from Matt Delorme.
Yes,
I
Matt.
actually, I just wanted to piggyback on something Gary said there, because it's really important in this climate consideration. Is so one, we're dealing with extreme events, right? So you're always in this peculiar situation where there's a relatively low chance maybe that something's going to happen, but it's quite catastrophic if it does, right? So you're in a bit of a funny risk situation. The second part of that is that, as Gary, you were alluding to there, is that emergency management piece of it needs to be combined with your adaptation planning, because what we see with communities is they'll come up with a great adaptation plan, but they might hit a barrier, like the project is a several $million project, and even at 90% funding, the community doesn't have the 10% to support that right now. So there's time that they're going to need to capitalize it. Or it may just be difficult to justify with that, percentage consequence balance there against continually providing their services, because a lot of places just have 100-year-old water lines that need to address that, climate change or not. So I just really picked up, Gary, when you were mentioning that emergency planning piece is that any adaptation plans should also consider what happens when the event happens, because we as a country, no matter how much we plan, aren't going to be able to build all of the adaptation that needs to happen. We are going to get impacted by climate events. And again, sort of thing we're really partial to is this, like looking at those in a regional approach with your neighbors, because if you look at PEI, they had a lot of difficulty during Fiona because places, roads were out and trees were down and emergency services couldn't get where they needed to. And that's where, if you got that plan in place, communicating with your neighbors, knowing where people go when places are not habitable beforehand, it'll make that disaster event a lot easier when it does happen. So yeah, thanks, Gary. I just wanted to expand on that because it was a really great point you raised.
I just wanted to put in a plug here for Gary's Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities information, or whoever had shared the training, just to say Tanama Bay has included that training now with our Public Asset Management Committee. So all the members of council and members of that committee have had that training, and as they rotate, the new members get that training, and along with the CNAM one-on-one training. And it has been, at least the feedback I received, a helpful introduction for people, especially those coming right off the street without any background. So just wanted to put in a little plug for that, as I see they're promoting it right now.
Jonathan Meakin?
Yeah, that whole point about when you're faced with numerous challenges and the difficulty of prioritizing. I think one of the things that I've started to look at, or try to, is to look at the ICSP and also the MCAP documents that were done around about the same time. If nothing else, I think what I'm hoping that will provide a bit of a place to begin, because there was some work done there. I mean, it's old, obviously, it's 12 years old or more, but I think perhaps there's an opportunity there to sort of begin to look at, or begin to help identify some key vulnerabilities in any given region or municipality or community within those. And then from there, I think, hopefully start to begin some adaptation measures. Just wondering what your thoughts are on those existing resources, and how possibly, municipalities could build on those as a foundation and go from there.
I can jump in quickly on that. I'll give you a very strong and firm "it depends." When we've come across those documents, one thing I've seen quite a is that they're a little bit general in terms of scope, and it's difficult to pin down exactly where to focus. That's again something where something like I mentioned, the PIVC large portfolio analysis can help you narrow those things down. And I'm actually out on a bit of a crusade to fight the impression that you have to be an engineer to use or make use of those documents. They are built to be used and usable for a broad range of people. If you, on the other hand, do have one where you really did identify some very concrete climate risks and concrete projects to address those, then you're probably well suited just to run with those, because if anything, it's probably just that in the intervening time, those risks have gotten a little bit more present. They probably haven't gone away or changed. They probably just become a little more urgent. So it would just be a matter of taking a look at like the plans, and some of them I see are specific and some are not, but the specific ones for sure can be brought into that asset management planning process because you have the risks and the measures identified.
Yeah, and
Gary?
there's a great resource that I haven't had a chance to read yet, but it was an article in the Journal of Environmental Planning and Management that looked at the MCAP. So it's titled "Municipal Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation from Planning to Action in Nova Scotia." But I can't speak to the usefulness of the article, but it appears to be thorough at first blush. So I'd just be anyway. But your point is well taken, and I do think our own MCAP does sort of suffer from that sort of general overview. So I think, yeah, we'll see. Thank you.
If I can make a build on that comment, when we started moving into communities, we definitely reviewed the MCAPs for the larger ones that have done them, and almost to a community, the number one climate hazard was flooding. Flooding, and that prompted, through conversations that ourselves and others had, including NSFM, conversations with the province, tried to move forward, and I think it did, the stakes on how to fund and deal with flooding across the province. There's a whole slew of things that happened after that. There's issues around flood mapping and so on. Again, I don't want to get down into the details of this right now, but the challenge there still remained for municipalities to be able, first, to get at the information they needed in order to move forward from the MCAP into implementation. Good point, Jonathan. Secondly, even with the tools in hand, to be, have the capacity to interpret that and work it into an implementation plan just wasn't there for the communities. So, as much as we could, being a small consultation firm, as much as we could, we did work with communities on a lot of those issues, and did bring tools in and did try to utilize them to implement plans, and some had some success with it. But again, it was still early. People weren't really that focused on doing this, as Matt suggests, on a regional basis, which I think is a good idea. And tackling it en masse. It was almost a one-of for every single community, and for some good reasons, meaning the assets that they had were certainly different than other communities, and their priorities were different. But there was still this lack of capacity from municipality to municipality, from community to community, to be able to go from tool, to go from information into implementation. So that's where the gap was. I think the gap is narrowed. But I think that's what we're kind of talking about today, is how do we get through this gap to the point where these communities are implementing these. There are tools there. It's just a matter of making that jump.
That's great. Thank you.
All right, seems that we're at about the end of our time. I don't see any more hands up, so I wish to thank both Matt and Gary for two excellent presentations and bringing this topic back to the forefront of some people's perspectives. And hopefully we won't need too many more extreme events to convince our elected officials that this is very worthwhile undertaking. So thank you guys, and hope to see some of you on our next seminar.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle.